Okie dokie. Looks like I've worked it out now. I was having a bit of trouble with my computer. That's what happens when I get left in charge, but I think I've got it now. So we're going to make a start. I'm hoping that people have either seen or managed to kind of pick up that this is our part two of making sense of the senses. So last month in our Lunch and Learn, Megan presented more on sort of that theory side. So kind of what is our sensory system, and what might a little bit of that sensory processing look like. So this is going to build on what she was talking about in that particular presentation. So I've added a little bit of a recap, just because I think that's always helpful. So you will be at an advantage if you have looked at that material. So if you're watching this later online, might be worth just having a look through that one first. If not, I will be trying to make sure that when I'm talking about things, I'm linking it back. So even if you haven't watched it, whilst you might not have as much background information, you won't be totally lost. I'll make sure that I'm sort of talking a little bit about things as we go. As always, as well, we're recording this so we can put it up later. So we will turn the recording off for questions at the end. But as I'll say at the end, if you do have any questions and you weren't able to make it in person, my details will be at the end, so you can send us. We're always happy to help. Okie dokie. So as I said, a little bit of a recap from Megan's presentation last month. So what we did is we explored sensory processing and a little bit of modulation. I'll recap that in a minute. So we learned about the 8 senses, which include vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell, vestibular, proprioception, and interoception. I'm going to strip myself up there. And so, for those of you who weren't going to go, Megan would have touched on, we know a lot about our 5 senses, what we call our external senses. So that's, all the first lot. And then we also have 3 what are called internal senses. So vestibular, that's kind of your inner ear. So spinning, kind of where you are in space terms upright. And then proprioception is the senses in your muscles, so how much kind of pressure you're getting there. And interoception is essentially the feelings from your organs. So all that kind of body sensation tells us when we're hungry and we're full, when we need to go to the bathroom, when we're thirsty, if we're in pain. So that's kind of our internal organs. And that could pretty much be a presentation on itself. I probably will touch on that a little bit more today, but that's sort of what she spoke about. And so within then those senses, she then spoke about this kind of quadrant that we talk about with sensory processing. So you'll see there, we've got passive self-regulation and active self-regulation. And basically between there, we've got some hypersensitivity, which is like really low, so you feel everything, and hyposensitivity, which is really when you've got what we call a high neurological threshold. And so you can miss a lot of that as well. And I do have to apologize if you can hear some little snoring in the background. Hugo's asleep. And of course, his favorite thing to do is interrupt my recordings with his snoring, but he's very cute. We can practice all doing our auditory processing and drowning him out, but I do apologize for anyone who struggles with that sort of sound stuff. So sorry, just back to the quadrants. It can seem like there's a lot of words, and I know even myself, sometimes I really have to think about it when I'm talking about it. The best analogy that I've seen, actually, it's from a YouTube clip. And I might try to add them to the slides because I really enjoyed it. And it was sensory processing from a child's point of view. And in this video, it's the child talking through his own kind of feelings and like sensory modulation himself. And he talks really nicely about basically how each sense, and when we're looking at our sensing processing, is like a cup. So for example, if you're kind of down the bottom of that quadrant, so really having that hypersensitivity, very, very hypersensitive, you feel everything a lot, you have a really tiny little cup. And then if you're on the other end, the top end there, you've got that high neurological threshold, you need lots of sensory input. It's like having a massive cup. And that's the way I like to think it goes, tiny and all up here. So the idea with that and why it's important is that you could have exactly the same amount of sensory input. So if we imagine that as the water in a cup, and for one person, it might make their cup overflow, and another person, they might not even notice. And so where we want to get to in what we call the just right state is like a perfect amount of water. So it's, we're able to function. So we're not absolutely overflowing. We're so overwhelmed and we're not getting no information. We're kind of at where we want to. We're nice. We're able to attend. So particularly when we talk about children, attend to learning. But in a way that we're not overwhelmed, but we're also not trying to then like get our bodies regulated. So for adults, what I usually say is you can think of it like a cup of coffee. So, naturally, and what I'll be talking about today is we do a lot of our own sensory regulation. And so this is nice to think about yourself and the people around you, or if you have a child in mind, to kind of think about their sensory processing. So with adults, we know we might get up in the morning and we might really feel like we need something to get us going. And that's when we'll have a cup of coffee, when you hit that sweet spot. But if you had too many cups, if you overdid it, you'd end up like an anxious mess. And that is exactly what we're talking about with sensory processing. So your body is telling you something, it's giving you a need, it's going, I need energy. And so you give it that, but if you give it too much of that, it's overflowing. And that's a really lovely way of putting it. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is very much that you have a different cup for everything. So you might have a really small cup for sound and then everything's too loud. But you might have a really big cup when it comes to vestibular movement, and that's the kids who are fidgety and want to get lots of input so they can do kind of attend, but then might get really dysregulated and upset if there's lots of sound. So it's this constant kind of thing where you've got all these different competing senses and different cups for all. So that's why I guess when we're talking about sensory stuff, we do kind of chunk it up. So we kind of did the theory last time, and we are going to focus a little bit on the strategies. Before I get into that, I guess what I'll sort of add to again today is that there is a difference between what Megan was talking about, which is sensory processing, and then what we're talking about today, which is more sensory modulation. Essentially, sensory processing, it very much says it there, it's how our nervous system receives, organizes, and interprets that sensory information. So there's actually a few things that go into there. So what we're talking about, those processing, the small and the big cups, that's sensory processing, right? So that our cups are kind of, we're getting the input, and then our own bodies are kind of going to the brain. And basically from there, there's a bunch of stuff that goes on the brain. So our brains like to look for patterns. So it goes, do I know what this is? Have I seen this before? And then it'll kind of think, do I need to pay attention? Do I not? So that's kind of when you're starting to go to sensory modulation. But essentially, it's just receiving that and processing it in the brain. And then the modulation of that is like the next level. So that's, sorry, when you're saying your brain's like, oh, what is this? And it kind of starts relating it. And then from there, it'll tell the body what to do with that information. So no, we don't need it. No, it's not important. Oh, what strategies have I got to deal with this? And this is really important as well, because your processing, so how big your cup is, really affects then your modulation. And so what we know a lot with, let's say, our neurodiverse population is sometimes, because it's really difficult for their brain to register how their body is feeling, sometimes it is until their cup is overflowing that they realize there's a problem, and then the brain can't process it. So it's kind of this thing where it does become quite complex, and when we're talking about the brain and how it relates to things, but if we just need to narrow it down, particularly for this presentation, processing, kind of the input, and modulation is kind of understanding, and then basically the adjusting. So, it's defined as the capacity to regulate and organize. So it's really the adjusting. So it's kind of, you've got the sensory information, your body has a particular kind of reaction and preference, and then what do you do with that information? And so, so it's our own personal preferences and basically what strategies we have. And that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit now. So this is the neuroscience-y bit. If you've been to my presentations before, I love the neuroscience of it, but trying not to get too bogged down in it, because yeah, I could talk all day about that stuff. It's very complex and really wonderful, but I'll try and keep it to a minimum today. So yeah, I think I've also talked about like this a little bit in when we looked at whole body listening and kind of, I guess, what that looks like and maybe some of the myths around that. But there is no normal. So every single person processes information through their senses in a different way. And what we talk about is not necessarily, we're not looking at there's something wrong with you. If you are really sensitive to something or if you miss lots of sensory input, there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone is different. Everyone has, there are lots of strengths and difficulties with both ends of the spectrum. What it is, though, is when it really interferes with our daily life, interferes with what we need to do. So it's really important that when we're talking about sensory modulation, the way that we really I guess, approach it at CC therapies, where we're looking at being really neurodiverse affirming, is that there is nothing wrong with you. And we're not looking at things like some of the sensory integration, you kind of look more at exposure and things like that. We're not going to force you into, going over and over and over and kind of that, exposing you to sensory input, which is distressing, just so you get used to it. Because often the way that we are in our neurological thresholds, that's kind of just us. And yes, you can sort of over time kind of adapt and learn, but essentially it's about being able to function in the way that you can successfully. And, if you find a certain input distressing, I don't think it's great for mental health. We know from the research, it's not great to mental health to go over and over and over that. So, for example, and again, if this is a bit technical, don't stress, but there is a certain intervention called the Wilberger's brushing protocol, which is essentially where there's a little brush, and for sensory defensive kids, usually we're looking at the autistic community, you just brush, and I don't like it for multiple reasons. Number one, it's a protocol and you have to do it every day, and poor parents, it's a nightmare. But as well, it can be really traumatizing and distressing for neurodiverse individuals. Now, in saying that, I've seen some people have come back and talked about it and gone, oh, I actually really liked, I think that was really good. It helped with my tactile sensitivity. I actually really like the brush personally. I'm like, that's my lovely sensory. I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. So it's very tricky, but from a neurodiverse affirming point of view and trauma-informed practice, we will not expose you to something you find distressing. That is not the goal around mental health. If you have tactile sensitivities, we will work with you on adaptions to help you do what you want to do and what you need to do. If someone came to me and said, look, I've got this real sensitivity and I need to kind of get used to it, we would work on that, and we would work on more cognitive strategies. So if it's distraction or using another sensory input to help. But again, when we're looking at neurodiverse affirming practice, that's about the person and their goal and them basically being in charge of their body, their sensory input, and how we do that in an affirming way. So I guess that's just really important to talk about the way that we practice here, because, you might come across other ways people practice. This is very much the lens that we come from when we're talking about sensory modulation from our perspective. Okie dokie. Oh, I did love putting in some more slides. We've kind of got this. So I guess the most important thing from this slide, though, is that it's not linear and it's not simple. And what might be calming for one person, obviously we've just touched on that, it might be different for different people. But even within yourself, you'll know that there might be a sensation that you really love one day and you don't love the next day. And so it's really important to understand that even when we're looking at an individual, there could be huge variances. And this is also, I like to explain this. Most people have like a preferred playlist, but sometimes, if we're looking at the generic music as your sensory input, there are different types of music that you will relate to depending on your mood. So sometimes, you might really want your angry music, or you might want your calming music. And I know even for myself, there's like some chill out music I like with words, but then when I'm working, I prefer more of a lo-fi type, no words, because I get distracted. One of my colleagues works with like your sound and audiobooks. I couldn't do that, but for her, that's where her regulation needs are. But I don't know if she does that every day. So when we're looking at these things, remember that it is very, very much about context and that person in that particular moment. And again, things like how you're feeling, how your body is, pain, temperature, all the other sensory input, your level of stress and fatigue. It's very much to remember that this is not only not a one size fits all, but even within itself, it can be quite complicated. And I guess that's one of the things that we come up a lot when we're looking at sensory processing and sensory modulation. Sometimes from the outside, it can seem really simple. And I think that's why we have lots of sensory tools on the market where people are like, oh, yep, they're fidgety. Here's a wobble stool. They're like weighted blankets that's calm. And those things are available readily for a reason. Like they do actually do really great jobs. But that doesn't mean that they're going to suit everyone. And so we have to be really mindful that, yes, these are great tools and certainly trialing them is a really good way of going about it. But remembering there's times and places and people that might not be appropriate. And again, I'll break down some of that as we go. I think I have some more slides on that. And I guess I wanted just to add this as well, is why is this so important? So obviously we focus a lot on psychosocial goals here at CC Therapies. So really for us, mental health and sensory are very linked. But beyond that, not just when we're looking at our moods, which is incredibly important, but when we're thinking about what we have to do and what we kind of want to do, sensory input is basically inescapable. The only time you can completely get rid of it is when you're in a sensory deprivation tank. So when we're talking about sensory again, it's this really complex thing where all our activities are very much impacted by the environment and the sensation. So, for self-care, when we're looking at feeding, you've got things like gagging on food texture. You've got different types of clothing that could interact with that. And even things again, so you're looking at clothing, uniforms, like school uniforms or work uniforms, they're very restricted. It's like, this is the uniform, this is usually the type of fabric. And it's certainly gotten better, but it's like, well, you have to go to school and wear a uniform. Now, if you are incredibly defensive in terms of your tactile input, that can have a huge impact on school. If you find that distressing, then that might make kids not want to go. And then you've got some, contributing to already what is often complicated for autistic kids. School is hard, loud, noisy, and then you've got this frustrating fabric. It just makes life really difficult. So then as well, different work environments. Most people have a feeling on open offices. Some people love it, some people hate it. It can be really difficult to manage that, and as well, not everyone gets the beautiful choice to work how they want. So the environment, and that can really impact. Social life, some people really don't do well at parties. Some people really love and thrive in that environment. Some people need to talk and walk. Some people really love walking groups where they can chat. Other people, they want to just do, we talk a lot about like parallel play, even in adults, with autistic individuals. Like, I want to sit quietly with you in our house, you on that end of the couch, me on, I'm doing my activity, you're doing yours. But that's nice. That's how they connect. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If that's how someone is regulated and connecting, that's exactly what we want. Leisure again, it's like, music and sport. And I really love, obviously, we're very gender and big with the LGBT community. We love and do lots of things with them. But I saw a really lovely thing from a drag queen, and it was talking about how great it is that we have social media and they can engage with drag queens, because sometimes drag bars, incredibly loud and bright, and there's lots of noise and screaming, glitter, which is beautiful and amazing to go see these huge performances. But if you're sensory sensitive, it can be really hard if you like it, but you can't engage with it. And so it was really lovely, this person talking about, it's okay if you can't come out and see me perform, you being able to view my content and enjoying that, that's enough for me. I really like that. So I thought that was a wonderful kind of example of how sensory processing can maybe stop you from doing the things you love, but actually we can help you find other ways to engage in those really important hobbies for you. So I guess that's what I like to say is it is one of those things that's deceptively simple, but hugely, it has a massive impact. So people will seek what they need adaptively or maladaptively. So if we cannot provide, that just right state, particularly for young people when they're developing, it will be very difficult for them and they will have a really hard time engaging in what they need to do. And again, what we need to think about is if we're asking them to do these really high level things, like school is just the biggest one because it's hugely important. It's busy and tiring, but also a sensory nightmare. It is really, really difficult for these individuals to engage in that and do it regularly. And so it's no surprise then if our bodies and our needs are not kind of being met, that then we see some of these maladaptive kind of coping strategies, which is school refusal, running away, being disruptive, fidgety, all that kind of stuff. It's just our body really, when we talk about behavior, it's like, okay, it's behavior, but what's under that? And a lot of the time, when we're thinking about how we can intervene with mental health and behavior, sensory is really important because it has a huge impact. So I did put a little tiny bit of strategies, but I'm going to talk more about it. And if you have a specific individual, I guess if there's a couple of things you can take home from today, it would really be that everybody is different. Shock horror. So if you have a specific person or yourself even, and you have just some questions for us about understanding more sensory input, please reach out to us. Obviously, without knowing all the details, we can only give you some generic answers, but hopefully we can give you some slightly more generic targeted answers. Visual. So, okay, we're going to talk about these little quadrants again. So I'm basically going to very much talk about little cup, big cup, because there's lots of words and things. And so I'm going to do my best just to simplify it. Right. So if someone likes lots and lots of visual stimulation, basically it's a little bit easier. It's like, you want to use high contrast, you want to do bright colors, you've got lots of things to engage and pay attention. So for example, in this presentation, I try and keep most of my graphics fairly simple because it's like information and you want it to be clear and bright. And even I've used ChatGPT in the past when I've got socials. I'm like, does this, I can't tell. I don't know if this is really clear visually. And it's like, no, change the colors here. So it's really important, I guess, to make sure things are clear, but then engaging. So I've chucked up memes all through this because I'm like, oh my gosh, who wants to look at boring backgrounds? I like a little bit of visual stimulation. That's kind of, I need a little bit of that in my cup. So I'm throwing a little meme in there. And that's what I've kind of done. So you want to be looking at interactive things, kind of engaging, moving. Where it can become tricky is obviously then if you've got a really tiny cup of visual, you've got these problems where you kind of need like dim lighting and really plain and really clear. I guess the trickiness is, again, I'm going to talk about schools the most because, again, that is the hardest part that we do. And if you've been in a classroom, you'll know that there's a lot of information. So what is really interesting, I actually just found this out from a professional development I went to. When we go and look in the classrooms, I think we look from an adult perspective and we look at, even if we're looking at where the child's sitting in the classroom, we're standing here. That's actually not the perspective that the child has. What we need to do is get down on their level, kneel down to where their desk is, and then look around. Because all of a sudden, when you're up here versus when you're down here, there is a lot more visual input that you have to process and modulate. So one of the things that is always really tricky with classrooms is that there is this beautiful artwork and posters and all these lovely things around the room. And we want that because the room is warm and engaging. However, if you really struggle with, I guess, a lot of visual input, if it's really hard for you to filter out, all of a sudden you've got this really tricky situation where that's actually too much and that's making it really hard for you to kind of see the board, pay attention to it. And one of the things that is really, really tricky when we're honoring everybody's individual preferences is you can have two people in the same environment who are having very different experiences. And that's where I guess OT is really nice because we can come in and help you problem solve. We're great at life hacks and problem solving. Some really easy things you can do is the kid that wants to have a lot of that out of the picture, move them forward. The other kid might go back. Thinking about who is placed next to the window in a classroom. I had a little person the other day who's like, oh yeah, I'm next to the window and I'm always looking out there. Like, oh, great. That's not helpful for that particular child. But then we looked around the classroom and there was actually nowhere better for them to go because it was like something else over the other side, and kind of then there was like a door and there was a whole bunch of other stuff. So it was actually ended up being the best place for them, which is really tricky. So this is where maybe you'd look at things like, could you put some plain cardboard over there? Could you have curtains or shades that you draw up and down? Even things like if you can't adapt or modify the room, the classroom, because that's hard, do you have like a breakout space or a calm corner? Because yeah, there might be times when you have to be in a very stimulating environment. And so it's just kind of part of life, like shops, horrible, horrible sensory nightmares. Sometimes we do need to go to the shops. There are adaptions like, click and collect groceries. But when we do have to go in, it's like, okay, let's make this as easy as possible and do what I can do, but then let me have some refill time at the end and kind of, get my body back to where it needs to be regulated. So having breakout spaces, or even if you're doing different activities, this is also where, again, very complex, we kind of multi-layer with sensory input. So if it's bright in the classroom because it has to be, maybe we can reduce, if they're auditory sensitive, maybe that's when some noise cancelling headphones can come in. And all of a sudden it's like, well, you don't have all the senses that are overstimulated. It's just kind of, we're reducing that load. There's also things like little, I don't know what they're called. I wish I'd looked it up. Sorry. Like little desk. You can get them from IKEA. I'm sure you can get them from other places. Little desk, like petitions, almost like in the office. You can have those. So there's a little portable one that I've seen which just pops up. And it's like it can divide the space. Now, in saying all of this, one of the biggest challenges I find when I'm doing, sensory strategies with kids is they don't like to look different. So if you're the kid who has a little pop-up tent on your desk, sometimes that cannot be ideal. And so that's, again, this real complexity around sensory processing and strategies is that, the kid needs adaptions, but then doesn't want to stand out. And this is why we just have to constantly problem solve. But yeah, that is an example. Other really good kind of tools is when we're giving worksheets, again, school, and if it has lots of text on it, you can just do like a visual finder. This is very, very, oh no, I didn't turn my notifications off. Sorry. I hope that didn't come across the screen. It's just like a cardboard cutout with a little strip in the middle. And so it's almost like a viewfinder. So you can just look at this piece and then we move it down and this piece. And so all of a sudden we've moved away from that distracting stimuli. I won't go into it, but there's lots of other complexities with vision, like, visual processing difficulties. That adds another layer. I won't get into that. It's really interesting, but that is to say that, again, when you're looking at things, it's so difficult. But lots of really lovely, easy things, again, like sunglasses. What can you do? Stimulating things that if they want that more, can you have like pictorial, images on like a visual schedule, things like that. There's lots of really lovely kind of, beautiful visual things. Got all my lava lamps in the background, but, lava lamps that are kind of nice and you can look and get some beautiful regulation, but it's not over the top. So it's about the young person kind of finding that nice fit. But yeah, like I said, schools are really tricky because you have lots of kids with lots of different needs. And yeah, just filtering out the information I tend to find is the most difficult with that one. Okay, auditory, so beautiful. This is one of the things that is the trickiest that we come across, is that background noise can be insane. But then, like, for example, you can be parenting is often like, you'll be screaming at your kid, they won't answer, you'll be like calling out their name. All of a sudden, if you say something little, they'll be like, pick up on it. Which is really interesting and quite funny. So we do have this problem sometimes where noises are very different, and it's very kind of funny because often we have kids who are really sensitive, and then They might go home and stim, and we're very pro stimming here. But I did have, families who sort of go, oh, they're really sensitive noise, and they come home and make this huge stimming sound. And it's loud. It's like, yeah, actually, that seems like a really weird paradox, but it's this thing where when you're in control of the sound, it's consistent, you know what's happening, you get a bit of the vocalization, kind of gives you a bit of a physical sensation. So it can be really terrific to understand what's going on sometimes with kids in auditory. So when we've got seeking, it's really nice, I like to do, and again, I fully recognize it's difficult in schools. I like to do a bit of a visual and an auditory. So when I was running a group with some teens, we actually worked out that I'd be trying to talk, but it was really noisy and they didn't want me to speak too loud because sometimes they would startle. So we got a little visual cue. I think it was just a ribbon or something silly. And kind of I would sort of wave it when I needed their attention. And we agreed that as a group, I like to be really playful. So I think it was something stupid like a fairy wand. And I kind of go, oh. And yeah, that visual stimuli would be like, oh, okay, yeah, we need to listen to Hannah. Because sometimes if kids are really concentrating and really like hyper focused, all of a sudden having someone, apologies, I'm about to clap, clap right near you, it's a huge startle. And when you have that startle, your regulation goes out the window. So we want to be really mindful. Sometimes we can do like a nice call and response, but sometimes kids might also need a little visual kind of response as well. So very much that's kind of, it's very easy if kids want more auditory stimulation because you can add music and you can kind of engage with them. It's, I think there's a lot more around, we've got things like loop headphones and noise cancelling headphones and all that kind of stuff. So it does help around background noises. Again, I think this is tricky because like the visual processing, you also have auditory processing disorders. And then that is a complexity as well. So, sometimes it's not just about being able to hear, it's about being able to process. So when you're thinking about how to help someone, I guess, pay attention to the auditory stimuli they need to, it's about multiple things. Can you give instructions in a written form as well so they don't have to retain that? Can you reduce the background noises? Can you tell people, I think the biggest one that it can be really tricky at schools, again, is like assembly time or parade. Really tricky sensory wise, lots of sound, people talking, kids usually, jostling next to you. It can be really tricky. So, for kids who are really struggling to engage in school, do they need to go to parade or can they sit at the back or can they take a break? How can we modify this so they can participate? So thinking about how we can reduce that stimuli. Can the kid wear headphones in there? And that's it, as well as some nice, like you can get like little ones that are hiding. Lots of kids just like wearing their own headphones because they're kind of very socially acceptable now. It's not like you used to with the big, kind of sensory, noise cancelling headphones that you used to have, like that are earmuffs. So lots of different ways that you can do that. And I think, yeah, preparation for when you've got fire drills, vacuuming, blenders, most parents with neurodivergent kids know, we don't turn on the big light straight away and we don't use the vacuum cleaner without warning. And it just, again, it gives someone the chance to kind of prepare themselves. Can they move away? If it's a fire alarm, I know that's going to be distressing. Can we do all that stuff? What can we do to help this person participate in the activities that they need to and want to? Olfactory smell. So smell is actually really, really interesting because it's one of the first senses that develops. When we think about babies, and we'll talk about this more in sensory attachment, which was a requested lunch and learn for next time. Smell is first, and it's, you can smell the mum. You can't see, I don't really hear. You haven't got much going on. You can feel a little bit, but smell is really, really early on. And the really interesting with smell, and I'm going to stuff this up, so I apologize for getting the fact almost correct, but smell is the only sense that doesn't kind of, it doesn't always register in terms of like conscious thought. It has like a direct line to the brain, which is why it's really linked to memory. And it can be really interesting because if you think about a smell or, you've had a smell and it like, we sort of say it might take you back to childhood, you're like, oh, that smell, it really triggers a certain memory. And that can be a really good thing if it was a pleasant smell that you love, like if it was like Sunday roast. I used to love that. But it could be really tricky if that smell is really triggering. And what we know in particularly individuals who've experienced trauma is that there might be certain smells where there's not a what we call explicit memory, and it might be triggering them because that kind of idea of the body remembers. The brain's job is to protect you. And so all of a sudden, it's very attuned to smells. And so what can happen is people can be triggered and not even know why because they don't have that connection in the brain. And that can make things very, very tricky. But I think it's really important to talk about because it's this huge consideration that you have to do. And so again, it's like, okay, how do we help someone with this? So again, we've got lots of kind of, tools that we can use. Again, smell is one of those ones. It's the same with auditory and sound and music. It's really personal, and what one person loves is not the same. You'll have that all the time. Taste is the same. So when we're giving people options around smell, it's really nice to have a few different things. And often, if we're looking at making a sensory kit in the office, we'll have lots of things to try. So peppermint, sometimes they talk about that being really alerting. Lavender obviously is very much, associated with calm, but some people hate lavender. That's fine. Coffee is one I really like. Surprise, surprise. But I find it like that a nice alerting, calming. Like it's like, oh, a good cup of coffee just like makes me feel in that perfect because it's like the smell is nice and it kind of reminds me of the things I love and it's nice and warm, but it kind of puts me in the state where it's like, yeah, this is kind of enough for my system. It's kind of filled my cup to the perfect level without it overflowing. So this can also be really good around, smell can be good because it's sort of, you can override one input. So for example, if there's a particular setting someone's going into where they don't like the smell of something, like sort of yeah, my brain's coming blank. But if you have something kind of separate that they can have, and you can have like something subtle, whether it's, some perfume on your wrist or even like a little piece of felt with some oils on it, they can kind of sneakily do that. And it sort of just helps get them through. That's kind of the way to do it. We try to, like with our cleaning products here, because we've got very sensitive kids, we try and use cleaning products that aren't as pungent, because that just sort of makes it a little bit more pleasant when people come in. Because even as well, when you're looking at things like when you've got a small cup, but maybe people don't notice, sometimes, it might be even distracting. It might not be distressing, but it just might be really hard for them to focus. But you've again, using that stuff, sitting away from kitchen's bins. If someone's cooking, putting on the exhaust fan, maybe letting them know if you have to do something, being, and they're coming to the house, be like, hey, this is happening, but this room's been closed off, so you can go do that. They're just being really mindful, I guess, as well. Taste. So what I will add with taste, because again, totally personal, and kind of one of those ones that it's like, yes, add spice, or no, have really nice, bland, predictable things. But I guess that's the other thing with taste. We're talking about the taste buds, but the thing I sort of, it doesn't quite fit in there, but we add in there, is those kind of the chewy things. So we're not just talking about your taste buds, but we're actually talking about your proprioceptive input, because it's your jaw muscles. Because our mouths are really sensitive, same thing with our muscles around the mouth, we can get a lot of really good proprioceptive input from our mouth. So when we're talking about, our it's a worse word, gustatory input, we can also think about how the texture feels. And this is, people often have safe foods. There's foods that we really like the textures of. Sometimes also, again, that time of day, sometimes crunchy food can be really good for alerting if we're like really frustrated going and crunching something. We can look, some kids are okay with something like yogurt. Some kids, if you tell them it's yogurt, they're like, oh, that's disgusting. Or if they've got a lump of the yogurt, it's all about thinking about what the person likes, and everybody is different. And again, it's that kind of multi-layered thing. It's like they might like the texture of one thing, but then if the taste is different, or maybe there's a taste you're trying to introduce, or, if we're looking at like safe foods, and adding in Vegetables, painful. It might be okay. So let's look at like carrot, for example. If we're trying to go with carrot, it's like carrot can be very different in textures. We can have a steamed carrot, which is very soft. Or we can have a crunchy carrot if it's raw. And so again, you've got the same flavor and it's a vegetable. If you're trying to add that, it's very different. And, having a carrot by itself chopped up with maybe some dip might be the way to go for some kids, or having a carrot grated and then kind of hidden amongst things might work for different kids. You're still getting the nutritional input. It's still the carrot going into your body. It's just about thinking of that sensory environment to help us actually be able to achieve that. And again, that's where sensory modulation comes in. Just have a drink so I can continue chatting. Okie dokie. Texture. So we've already talked a little bit about this. I'm sure if you ask most parents, they've got a feeling about slime. What I will say with slime from working and just touching it here, not all slime is created equal. There is really messy, runny slime with bits in it. There's more like putty, which is much preferred. So again, when we're looking at seeking, and we have lots of young people here who absolutely love slime, but not all the type of slime. So we have to have lots of different types of slime. So even when you're thinking about something you might think the same, there's lots of considerations. And some slime really smells. So you've got a young person who might really want to be sensory seeking and tactile seeking, but then because it'll smell weird, they'll be like, no, thank you, I won't do that. So again, I just think that's a really lovely example of how things can impact. As I've already said, school uniforms can be an absolute nightmare. Sock seams, tags. I think it's a really lovely thing we've moved towards, which is a lot of garments, when you buy them now, that have the tags that kind of have the information sort of printed on them. Makes life so much easier. You can get sensory-friendly clothing as well. Sometimes it is a little bit more expensive because it's considered a medical aid, but there are options. You can also just do things like putting tights underneath, so whether that's leggings or footless tights or tights with, footed tights. There is a difference, and your young person will probably tell you which one. Having that on almost like a compression can sort of help, like young people who might not like shorts or the dress fabric. Having that on there might help kind of give them some proprioceptive input if they're nice and firm, which will be really helpful. But I guess on the other end of that is, maybe not having that kind of rubbing from the pants or skirt or whatever. This can become really problematic in Australia where it gets hot. So again, even thinking about things like, again, I'm sure there's different brands like Skins, so that the sporting clothing that you can have, tends to be a little bit better for sweat and kind of not as hot, and versus something that's like, a wool underlay. So again, we can do some things there. And, at the end of the day, having a disability and having sensory sensitivities, we want adaptation. So I think we're better, but I think advocating is really important. So, you can get a letter from us if your young person needs adaptations in their clothing, or how they wear their school uniform, because we want them to participate. And ultimately, I think schools have come to the party around being like, yeah, okay, if this person is to come and attend, they might need some adaptation with this. Because cutting off tags can be problematic. I've definitely cut off some for my kid and gone too far, and now there's a hole in them. So that's always really tricky. I should just get the pick unpick. But yeah, thinking about that stuff. Same with sensory clothing, underwear, obviously very problematic. How can there's lots of nice sensory underwear now, thank goodness. So as well, like all sensations, not all tactile input is made the same. So I really like rough, heavy input like this. Some people think that's horrifying. They want to run away. They think it's awful. I find this really nice and regulating, but again, completely get that that's not it. And that's why we have lots of different tools. Fidgets come up a lot. Now, fidgets are fantastic because often for young people, when they need to concentrate, a fidget's really good. When we're particularly looking at things like ADHD, having a fidget on you can kind of help them stay regulated enough. They've got something they're doing with their body. They're not doing this in the chair. They're not going madly wiggling, but it kind of helps them sort of attend. Fidgets then can be really tricky because all of a sudden we've gone from them to learning to being distracting. So it does get complex again. And again, if we're thinking about making classrooms friendly for everyone and everybody having their own needs, having a fidget that makes a lot of noise, like a clicking pen, can be really tricky. So what can we replace it with? Is there something that we can do which is still helping the young person get the need, but in a way that's not distressing another? There's things that you can do, again, when subtlety is a bit of an issue. We can kind of tactile's quite good because it's kind of easy to hide. We can put things in the pocket, even things like Velcro dots under the desk. You can get some nice sensory input. It's very easy. It's cheap. It can be removed because, again, money and DIY and all that kind of stuff needs to come into it. So just a little Velcro dot under the desk, fantastic. Again, if you've got the other end of the spectrum, there's lots of really lovely messy play and sensory places and that kind of thing. There's lots of those wonderful opportunities to get that. And again, I think if you're thinking about each tactile experience in fabric being different, it can be really nice going with the young person or whoever to pick out their kind of tactile tools. So not only are fidgets the same, but if you're thinking again about something really cheap and easy, going to, a craft store, Spotlight, whatever, taking the young person and they can pick some fabric and you only need like a little tiny square of it, maybe get a bit so you can chop it up into squares because they will lose it. But, something really soft and fuzzy versus maybe they like something more like tulle. Maybe that's nice, the crunchy feeling. Bubble wrap, we can get it more readily available. I'm sure the environment would hate me saying that, but, what else can we do? And it's like, okay, what kind of tools can we use really easily? And tactile's kind of a nice one. Your things like worry stones, really lovely, kind of put them in the pocket. You can feel them. They haven't arrived, but we've got some really lovely little sensory stickers. They're kind of like almost like sandpaper, not as rough, but they're just really nice. And you can put them on something. They don't look like anything. And all of a sudden you've got some really lovely sensory input. So again, it's like, okay, how can we help this? And even again, if you're looking at like things like hand washing, so important, do they prefer hand sanitizer? Hand sanitizer can smell wildly different. Is there an opportunity where if they don't like hand sanitizer, can they go wash their hands? All these things, again, it's like, how can we help this person participate in what they need to do with lots of different ways of getting them to do that? Vestibular, so this is balance. So really this is, again, I'm very conscious that not everyone has these huge budgets. We have this beautiful massive swing in here, which I've very purposely done because swinging can be really regulating for the body. Not everyone can put a giant swing in the middle of their house. So it's like, okay, what else can you do? So even things like little mini trampolines, I know they can get a bit costly. So great if you can get one, but what else can you do? Can you have an exercise ball, which you can sort of better on the price end of things, where you can pop up and down and kind of jump. What else can you do? Instead of swing, can you just go to the park and have a swing? I know that sounds really simple, but maybe like, if a young person is really struggling after school because they've had all this sensory input and there's a park on the way home, can you stop off at the park and swing so they can kind of calm down? You can get, I haven't tried them, so I don't know what they're like, but you can get indoor swings now. They're like bars that go across. Someone can tell me if they've had a good or bad experience with those, but they are out there. And things like jumping. You can get nice little rocking things now. I think we've got a couple here. They're much more affordable than what they used to be. So again, thinking about your space, I get sometimes we have smaller spaces and so movement breaks are hard. Wobble cushions can be really good. You can get a nice little wiggle. Even, if you've got office chairs that move, things like that. If you're in the classroom, can you get a special treat and sit on the teacher's chair and maybe do this and, wiggle a little bit, because sometimes wobble stools aren't always readily available. What else? So I guess with vestibular movement, it's sort of as well proprioceptive. When we're looking at the sensory input, the other thing we do see a lot of is like gross and fine motor and how that kind of comes into it. And particularly with individuals who have lower registrations of big carp, and quite often we do, that you've also got these complexities around developmental difficulties. So do they understand where their body is in space? Can they think about their movements? Are they coordinated? And I know this sounds a bit funny, but if you're doing things that require coordination, and really sort of, I guess, knowing where your body is, there are tools that you can use to help with that. And you might have seen as well, one of the tools I use all the time in the clinic is not just having, when kids come in and they really want to move around and they've got lots of energy, sometimes just letting them run can actually not regulate, because sometimes our body keeps getting hyper and hyper and hyper because our body's like, yeah, we're using lots of energy. We need this. Let's release more energy because we're playing sport or we're running from something. And so it doesn't actually calm them down. So yeah, they're getting energy out, and like later, great, they might sleep well. But in the moment, they're not actually calming down. So I might do something like an obstacle course, and I might be really, I know it looks simple, throwing things out. You're like, oh yeah, obstacle course. But what that's doing is engaging the brain as well. So they're still getting that movement, but they have to think about where their body is. They have to concentrate. They have to plan. So they're using their body in a way that's regulating. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about this stuff, is not only, again, that input, but where and how. I'm very conscious I've only got a couple of minutes left because I started late, which is always the bad thing with me, is I like to ramble. But yeah, there's lots of lovely movements you can do there. Proprioceptive, so like I mentioned, this can kind of be a bit tricky when you've got something and, yeah, bumping into things. Kids don't always know where their body is. The outline of their body is a bit fuzzy. So these are also the kids who kind of bash into walls and knock things over. But again, can you give them that input? Because when you know where your body is and what it's doing, it is like a safety thing. So having big hugs, big squishes, can we do like sausage rolls, rolling them up in things, rolling them with an exercise ball, lots of heavy work. So one of the really frequent strategies I use in classrooms is when a young person might need a movement break. Can the whole class have a little stretch? But also, can they do a job? So sometimes we like to sneak it in so they're not standing out, or maybe sometimes they want to be the person with the special job if they're really struggling to engage. So a lot of my kids, I've just said, have you got a ream of paper? Can they take a ream of paper to the office? Which sounds really odd, but it's like, it's nice and heavy and it seems like a job that's normal. It's like, great. And all of a sudden, reception, the teachers are sending lots of reams of paper. Can they hand things out? Is there a little trolley they can push? Can we practice doing, you can't really see chair push-ups, just pushing through the arms. Lots of things like that. Kick bands, like little resistant bands around the base of the chair. There's things like that. I guess on touch as well, one of the things I'll say is try to avoid light touch. If you're going to touch someone, warm them first and then nice and firm. All right, so I'm going to pause there and just mention that it might cut me off, but next time what I'm doing is talking a little bit more. People wanted to learn a bit more about sensory and attachment. So I might focus a little bit more on mental health and kind of that brain-body connection there, and kind of elaborate a little bit on that because, yeah, I think, oh no, it's gone. There we go. There is that kind of connection, as I sort of alluded to, around trauma and the body and kind of how it responds. And I think that kind of mental health aspect can link really nicely in with kind of that attachment stuff. I think that sort of works well together. So the next one that we will follow on from this is basically looking at mental health, including attachment and sensory modulation. I'm going to flick to my end slide. No, I'm not. There we go. So as I said, we've got to wrap up now, but that's my details there. Did I spell myself correctly? Yes, absolutely. But please feel free to reach out. Like I said, we're very passionate about this. If you've seen our office, you'll know we have that beautiful big swing set. We have an entire sensory room that is dedicated, and it's all really beautiful and wonderful. So we live and breathe sensory modulation here. So really happy to answer any of your questions, talk more about sensory stuff. And if there's future lunch and learns that you would like us to do, like I said, I think we've already got covered for next October, my goodness, October, which will be our last in our sensory series, unless someone else comes up with another topic. And then I think potentially in November and December, we've even got I think we're doing executive functioning, and then I'm doing another passion area of mine, adolescent brain, which is when I get nice and nerdy about the brain. So there are two, I think, coming up. But if you have any topics that you're really dying for us to do, please feel to reach out to that. Or if you pop on our website, we've got that. And also if you go to the blog on our website, we've got all our previous lunch and learns. But thank you, everyone. Thank you for letting me ramble about one of my passion projects. And like I said, please reach out, and I look forward to doing more lunch and learns next month.